Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Child Anxiety FAQ podcast. FAQ stands for Frequently Asked Questions, and I'll be answering your questions about child and teen anxiety. My name is Dawn Friedman, and I've been working with kids and families for more than 30 years. Now I run Child Anxiety Support, a membership program for parents of anxious kids and teens. Let's get started. This week's question is, how can I tell the difference between an accommodation and a support for my child's anxiety? And before I answer this, I want to define accommodation and support. I think it's confusing because when we talk about children who have 504 plans or an IEP for school, accommodations are a good thing. They're things that we build into those plans for that child's success in school. But when we're looking at the research on child anxiety or OCD, accommodations are a negative thing. And this is why I use the term pitfalls, as in parenting pitfalls, instead of accommodations when I talk about them on my podcast and in my child anxiety support program. For the purpose of this particular episode, I'm going to use accommodation because that's what the person who asked the question used, and again, because that's what the research uses. All right? So just to be crystal clear, we are not talking about the accommodations your child might have in their 504 or IEP. In fact, for this episode, I am going to use the definition that was used in a 2014 study published in the Journal of Anxiety Disorders titled Parental Accommodation of Child Anxiety and Related Symptoms. And I will put the citation in the show notes as well in case you want to go and look at that study. But their definition of accommodation is, quote, changes in parents' behavior in attempts to prevent or reduce child distress, end quote. Now that really sums it up. It's parental behavior, it can be other caregiver behavior, siblings, grandparents, but it's behavior not by the anxious child that's meant to prevent or reduce distress for that anxious child. I want you to really focus in on the prevent or reduce part of the definition. Accommodations are all about avoidance. They're about avoiding the feelings that come with being anxious, that feeling of distress. They are things that we do to help our child avoid feeling anxious. Common accommodations might include, and actually this is the most common one, reassuring children repeatedly, trying to help them feel better about their worries. This is a child who will ask if it's going to be okay, and we tell them it's going to be okay. This is when we say there's nothing to be afraid of. I'm sure it's going to be fine, those kinds of reassurances. This can look like intervening on a child's behalf, like ordering for them at a restaurant, or if somebody asks them a question, stepping up and speaking for them. This can be things like minimizing separation, maybe laying down with them at night. And I've addressed co-sleeping several times on this podcast in the past. If you want to see more about that, hear what I have to say about that, you can look at previous episodes. But I will say very quickly that it's changes in parents' behavior. Remember, that was the definition in the study, changes in parents' behavior. And so staying with them at night, if that's something that you wouldn't be doing if they weren't anxious, that makes it an accommodation. But accommodations also might be picking them up when they call you from school with a stomach ache, or taking them with you on errands you would rather run alone because they don't want to be left with a babysitter. You can see that these are about helping our child not feel worried. And it's natural that we would want to do this. You know why a baby's cries are so upsetting, right? Because we are meant to find them upsetting so that we will respond and stop those cries. Same with whining. We have a primal urge to prevent tears and upset in our kids. Very often, We are responding to our anxious children before we've even thought about it. It's almost instinctual. Our child is upset, and we immediately do what we can to minimize the upset. Accommodations can work for non-anxious children. A child might say, "What if my teacher is mad at me?" And we say, "Oh, they're not going to be mad about that." And a non-anxious child says, "Great," and they move on. An anxious child will tend to need more reassurance, and their need for reassurance will increase. They get hooked on it because they are unable to tolerate the distress of their anxiety. All children experience anxiety. In fact, all people do. But a child who has a problem with anxiety, an anxiety disorder, an issue with anxiety, feels it more often, feels it more deeply, and finds it more distressing, which is to say, they have good reason to want to avoid their anxiety. They are not weaker than other kids. They are not unreasonable. They are not trying to be manipulative. They are truly feeling that anxiety more intensely. It's a bigger deal for them. And avoidance is understandable. That said, avoidance doesn't help. Accommodations allow them to avoid, and again, avoidance does not help. Now, supports help them tolerate. Supports encourage their ability to stick with the thing that scares or worries them. Supports help children acclimate to their feelings of distress so they are able to increase that distress tolerance. All right? That's the major difference, and it's easy to remember. Accommodations allow avoidance. Supports help them stick with it. See? Alliteration for the win. Okay, so we're all on the same page now, and we understand what we're talking about, but now things are going to get tricky because a support can become an accommodation, or rather, we may need to accommodate a bit as we shift towards support. What I mean is, on our way to decrease accommodations and increase supports, we may need to move down the accommodation scale. All right, it's a journey. Let me give you an example. Let's say we have a child who is afraid of dogs, and so they won't go in the backyard because the next door neighbors have a beagle, and we all know beagles are very barky dogs. And this dog barks its head off whenever someone goes outside. So your child will not go out on the swing set anymore. They want to play on the swing set. They can't do it because they're afraid of the dog. A support to help them face that fear might be that a parent goes out with them. That helps them face the barking dog, get used to the sound of the dog barking, get familiar with the way the dog might jump at the fence, to see that the fence will definitely keep the dog on the other side. Maybe the child even gets comfortable enough to let the dog sniff them through the fence. We can see all of these reasons why having a parent go out with them might be a help. But after a while, if the parent needs to keep coming out, then the parent is no longer a support. The parent has become an accommodation because as the child acclimates to the barking dog, they now need to face their anxiety about doing it alone. Do you see how that works? How a support could become an accommodation? When we're planning to reduce accommodations and increase supports, we need to use a scale that helps us map levels of anxiety. And then we will work to move the child from the bottom of the scale where there is less anxiety towards the top where there is more anxiety. So maybe being out in the yard with a parent is like a 2 on the anxiety scale, and being out alone is a 10. We're going to work to help them get towards that 10, and then they won't be at a 10 anxiety by the time they're facing that 10-point fear. Does that make sense? We do this in a systematic way. We do it step by step so that we're not overwhelming the child and so we're not overwhelming ourselves. This is very important for us if we have kids who demonstrate their anxiety with meltdowns or other big behaviors. because that's how we get stuck in accommodations is our anxiety increases right up that scale too. And in fact, we might want to make a scale for ourselves so we can figure out what behaviors our child has that really make us anxious. If you are curious if your supports actually are more like accommodations, I encourage you to take my Parenting Pitfalls quiz at childanxietysupport.com/quiz, which is based on the Family Accommodation Scale Assessment. And then if you have questions after that, let me know because I'd love to answer them. Thanks for tuning in this week. And if you have a question you'd like me to address on the show, you can reach out to me by going to childanxietysupport.com and submitting a question there. You can also check out the program while you're there. And if you'd like to learn more about whether or not it would be a good fit for your family, feel free to reach out for a quick consult call. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next week.